It's rumoured that Cesare Borgia slept with his own sister Lucrezia, but according to someone within the family, the truth was even darker. The name Borgia is synonymous in history with treachery, hedonism, and scandal. Along with the equally infamous Medicis, they were one of the most powerful families in Renaissance Italy, and they made Game of Thrones look like child's play. The Borgias were the tight-knit brood of Rodrigo and his chief mistress, the beautiful Vannozza di Catane. While having a chief mistress at all might be scandalous enough, Rodrigo was actually the Pope, Pope Alexander VI to be exact, and he was supposed to be devoting his life to God, not mistresses. At this time in Italy, religious leaders possessed more power than anyone else. They had the ability to bestow riches, grant wishes, and ruin people's lives whenever they wanted. For a time, the Borgias had an iron grip on this power, and not just with Pope Alexander VI. His own uncle had been Pope before him. Rodrigo Borgia loved spending the Catholic Church's money on all manner of luxuries, and Vannozza di Catane was far from his only mistress. Just like his predecessors, he also had no problem handing out high-ranking offices to his friends and family. Rodrigo had 4 children with Vannozza: Giovanni, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. Of course, he also had numerous children with countless other mistresses. It was these 4, though, particularly Cesare and Lucrezia, who would soon go down in infamy. While Rodrigo was campaigning to become the new pope, he, perhaps understandably, refused to acknowledge the children as his own. Instead, he claimed he was their uncle. It wasn't until after he was elected pope that Rodrigo finally acknowledged his children, and was the first pope to ever do so in history. Naturally, this was highly controversial and only added to the Borgias' infamy. From a young age, Cesare was groomed to follow in his father's footsteps as a religious leader. Incredibly, he was only 15 years old when he became the Bishop of Pamplona. 2 years later, he was made the Archbishop of Valencia. As a side note, Cesare was a very handsome man. There are even claims that European depictions of Jesus Christ are based off of his face. But these good looks hid malevolence. Cesare was also said to be the most barbaric member of the Borgias. In the year 1499 alone, he ordered the execution of a Spanish constable, a soldier captain, and a bishop, among others. On May 10th, 1499, a 23-year-old Cesare married Charlotte of Albret. While she may have been beautiful, Charlotte had an even better asset. She was the sister of King John III of Navarre. Sadly, it was a loveless marriage. The Borgia family just wanted to secure powerful connections so they could keep their hold on Italy. A decadent, impulsive man, Cesare was known to have had at least 11 illegitimate children outside of his dull marriage to Charlotte. In contrast, he and Charlotte only had a single daughter together, Louisa. In the summer of 1503, both Cesare and his father Rodrigo were struck down by a terrifying and mysterious wasting illness. The 2 powerful Borgia men were both bedridden and feverish, though the exact cause of their ailment has never been confirmed. While Cesare survived, his father did not. Though he was originally groomed for a life of God and even rose to the rank of cardinal, Cesare eventually decided that a pious existence wasn't for him. Instead, he wanted to make war. In 1498, he became the first man in history to resign his position as a cardinal and became more involved in the military. It was said that for a time near the end of his life, Cesare covered half his face with a mask made of leather. It's unknown why he did, but a likely explanation is that syphilis scarred his once beautiful face. It seemed as though all his years of wild late-night carousing had finally caught up with him. In the end, the great Cesare Borgia died a brutal and undignified death. As his life wore on, he was eventually pushed out of power and increasingly despised. In 1507, he was fighting in a military campaign when a group of knights tried to escape the castle during a storm, only to be chased by a furious Cesare. His temper got the better of him, and he ran far from the safety of his own army, leaving him vulnerable. The knights quickly turned on him, stabbing him to death and stripping him of his opulent jewellery and fine clothing. Once a highly feared and hated leader, Cesare was left a cold, naked corpse in the middle of a violent storm. Lucrezia Borgia, the middle child and the only girl of the 4 Borgia siblings, didn't let her brothers have all the fun. In fact, Lucrezia was just as lustful and murderous as the rest of them. Smart, well-educated, and breathtakingly beautiful, even as a girl, Lucrezia was often used as a family bargaining chip. Her father and brothers sought out the most advantageous matches for her, that is, the political alliances that would most benefit their own ploys for power. Unsurprisingly then, she was married 3 times throughout her life. As a child, Lucrezia was given the best humanist education available at the time, but this was actually incredibly scandalous. Girls of her era were usually dependent on convents to give them their education, and the nuns would generally emphasise piety and godly obedience. Lucrezia's schooling in language, poetry, and oration was considered radical and even degenerate, but it was this education that turned her into a powerhouse. She was an excellent administrator as an adult, and thanks in part to her family's deep-rooted nepotism, she reigned as the governor of Spoleto all on her own. This lofty position had previously only been granted to cardinals of the church. As a young, eligible bachelorette, Lucrezia's family spent a lot of time finding her the right husband. In 1493, the Borgias found a perfect match for their 13-year-old girl, Giovanni Sforza. He was a count and an illegitimate son of their powerful rivals in the Sforza family. Apparently, Cesare grew unhappy once the marriage wasn't so politically useful for the family anymore, and tried unsuccessfully to assassinate his brother-in-law. Eventually, Giovanni fled to Rome to escape, and the Borgias pressured him into an annulment instead. After that, Lucrezia's family quickly married her off to Duke Alfonso of Aragon in 1498. As it turned out, this second marriage was even shorter than her union with Sforza, and far more violent. In July 1500, just as Alfonso's use to the Borgia family was also waning, hired killers attacked and stabbed him multiple times on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Miraculously, he survived the initial ambush, but as he was recovering, another group of armed men burst into his room and strangled him to death. After the dust settled, many whispered that Cesare Borgia was once more behind the hit. After all, Lucrezia was now free to pursue another advantageous marriage. In 1502, Lucrezia finally found her one and only, or at least a man who was useful enough to her family in the long term that they didn't have him brutally murdered. That year she married Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara. Lucrezia gave birth to 8 children during their union and enjoyed the life of a duchess. During this time, Lucrezia tried to shake off the dark reputation that had followed her family for decades. After the death of her father Rodrigo and her brother Cesare, she still managed to maintain a lavish position in aristocratic Italian society. However, she didn't let motherhood and matrimony stop her from having a series of affairs. Her most passionate tryst was with her own brother-in-law, Francesco Gonzaga. The two wrote each other a stream of feverish letters where they spent more time praising each other's bodies than discussing any notions of true love. Indeed, Lucrezia's affair with Francesco may have been motivated by revenge as much as lust. Francesco's wife was the elegant, cultured, and intelligent Isabella d'Este, whom Lucrezia had previously tried to befriend. Isabella showed no interest in being friends with Lucrezia. In the end, the Borgia matriarch Vanozzi de Catani managed to outlive all her sons, Only Lucrezia would live long enough to bury Vanozza after her death in November 1518. In 1519, Lucrezia was pregnant again and gave birth to a girl named Isabella, but the child was sick and died the same day. The 39-year-old Lucrezia had been dangerously unhealthy throughout her late-in-life pregnancy and became very ill after the birth. Alfonso tried to nurse her back to health, but to no avail. Lucrezia Borgia died just 10 days after she gave birth. The baby of the Borgia family was Geoffrey. In 1494, his father, Rodrigo, arranged to marry Geoffrey to the beautiful and powerful Princess Sancha of Aragon, who was the daughter of the King of Naples. It might have been a match made in heaven, except it was actually a nightmare. Seductive Sancha allegedly had affairs with both of Geoffrey's brothers, Cesare and Giovanni. On June 14, 1497, a tragedy and an enduring mystery struck the Borgias. Giovanni was brutally murdered under suspicious circumstances. He was last seen with Cesare and the rest of his siblings in their mother's home. After he left the house, he was never seen alive again. Instead, in the dawn light of the next morning, Giovanni's horse returned home, riderless. His body was later found in the Tiber River, with his throat slit and 9 stab wounds in his chest. In the aftermath of his son's murder, Patriarch Rodrigo was devastated, and he insisted on a thorough investigation. However, just a week into the case, he suddenly called the whole thing off. The reasons behind Rodrigo's decision are a mystery, as are the circumstances of Giovanni's death. However, there are some clues. Both Giovanni's brothers are suspects in his murder. Giovanni was taking on more responsibility and gaining more power in the family, which may have sent Cesare into a jealous rage. As for Geoffrey, well, Giovanni was having an affair with his wife. Of course he was. Given the circumstances, perhaps Rodrigo wanted to avoid pointing the finger at his own sons. Politically ambitious and not above lies and treachery, it wasn't long before the Borgias ran afoul of Italy's other noble families. These included the Medici as well as the Della Rovere and Sforza families. These movers and shakers of Renaissance Italy were constantly vying with and killing each other just to gain another small shred of power, and the Borgia ascendancy soon turned to a gradual descent. The Borgias remain fixed in our cultural memory. They've appeared as characters in hundreds of novels, films, television programs, and comic books. They even have a prominent place in the Assassin's Creed video games. The Borgias were well connected among the artists of the Renaissance, and they had good taste. Cesare Borgia even hired Leonardo da Vinci to be his military architect and engineer in 1502. While under Cesare's employ, da Vinci had total freedom to direct any construction project in any lands under Cesare's control. The Borgias' reputation for evil and deception survived long after their influence declined. In 1893, the artist John Collier painted Cesare, Lucrezia and their father seated around a banquet table. Cesare offers a cup of wine to an unknown young man who refuses, wisely perhaps given the Borgias' supposed penchant for poison. While there are certainly enough stories to paint the Borgias as great villains of history, there are some who argue their reputation isn't entirely fair. Modern historians now point out that many of the stories surrounding the Borgias come from a small handful of contemporary chroniclers, and the Borgias' many enemies. For centuries, there have been rumours that Cesare Borgia and his sister Lucrezia were actually involved in a passionate relationship with each other. However, the person who first made this claim, Lucrezia's first disgruntled husband, Giovanni Sforza, also said that the reason Pope Alexander broke up himself and Lucrezia was so that he could have the freedom to enjoy himself with his own daughter. Murder, incest, and military might. Safe to say George R.R. Martin has read a few books about the Borgias. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.